All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you that don't know, and I think everybody here knows, I'm Greg Blackhall. I'm one of the broker managers. And today we're going to talk about contract to closing. So the processes and everything from what happens from the time we get a deal executed until we show up to get it closed. Now, how do you service transactions from contract to closing? That's kind of the overreaching thought. Now, who actually thinks that you just write up a contract and then sit back and wait to pick up your check? I wish it was that easy. Now, there is one caveat to that, and I always throw this in there. When you do new construction, that is almost how it works, because the builder will actually take them and they pick out their furnishings, they kind of handhold it, and you more or less just kind of supervise to make sure everything is moving. But outside of new construction, there's a lot of things that really happen through the process. And we're going to talk about it from both the buyer side as well as the seller side. And then we're going to talk about some of the timelines and the requirements that come into it, and then understanding how to keep your lenders and your surveyors and your appraisers and your inspectors and all the other people that are going to have their hands in your deal moving toward a stress-free closing. I've yet to have a truly stress-free closing, but I've been told it's possible, so we'll see. So how do you service your buyers? The first thing, okay, so we've executed our contract, and on page 1 of the contract, right under the buyer name, the seller name, and the property address is the escrow deposit. It's the very first thing that we need to do. And by we, I mean, really, it's your buyer, but you need to be certain that you get a receipt for that escrow. Now, typically, the escrow is going to be held by the title company that's going to facilitate that closing. One other little caveat here that I point out. On the contract, it says escrow agent. Now, just because whoever is put on there is listed as the escrow agent does not mean that they have to do the closing. So in certain cases, attorneys will have escrow accounts or brokers will have escrow accounts, even though the closing may take place with somebody else. The difficulty with that is if a third party is holding the escrow, that money has to be wired to the closing agent. So it's a wire fee or it's some extra cost or headache involved in getting that done. So typically, the industry standard is whoever's holding the escrow is typically the title company that will actually be doing the closing. Now, a question that comes up pretty frequently is, should we as the agent deliver that escrow check on behalf of the buyer? Florida Legal has said technically we can, but what happens is the minute I take that check from the buyer, I am now legally responsible for it. So if I'm picked it up from my buyer, I'm going to the title company, my car gets broken into and that check gets stolen, I'm liable for it. So you certainly can. It's just a liability, and every agent kind of is up to their own devices as to whether or not that's a liability that they're willing to assume. Also, you want to make sure that you get a receipt for the escrow for your records. So if I give that title company a check, I want them to issue me a title or an escrow receipt to make sure that I say, hey, that check was deposited because, and it doesn't happen with our title people, but I have had instances where the check gets received, it gets credited to the wrong deal, it gets, put somewhere and doesn't get properly accounted for, and they come back and go, your buyer never made escrow. Well, no, my buyer did make escrow, here's my receipt. You always want to make sure that you have that documented. You also need a legible copy of the executed contract. So it's important, and the one thing I really emphasize here is legible. There are times where we will negotiate contracts and we'll change the sales price 4, 5, sometimes 6 times before we finally settle on an agreeable sales price or term or something like that. So what I typically do in those cases is just go ahead and execute a new page 1 of the contract. So that way, rather than 248,000, 236,000, 244, 237, to where you keep scratching it out and everybody initials and now it's just this humble jumbled mess. of signatures and numbers, and it's really hard to figure out what the final one was. What I typically do is if we've changed it more than twice, I just redo an entire new first page with the number we all agree on, and then everybody initials it, and we're good. Because you want to have legibility. You don't want the title company calling saying, well, is it 244 or is it 242? Like, I can't tell which one was the final. Just makes life so much easier. It needs to get to the buyer's lender if they're obtaining a mortgage, and it needs to get to the title company that's handling the closing. So as long as those two people have it, and then obviously your buyer and seller both need to have a copy of it. Now, additional information to the title company, and this is vitally important, and this is something that I harp on even when Becky's not sitting in the back of the room. The title company is going to need your buyer's contact information, the lender information. If there's a mortgage, they're going to need the mortgage company's information so they can get a payoff amount. The quicker you can get this to the title company, the smoother your life will be. If they're chasing you down to try and get that information so they can get started with everything, we're just creating undue delay with the process. So we want to just be aware of this from the beginning and just be mindful that we want to stay ahead of things as much as we can. The other thing is we need to know whether the buyer is going to be a buyer or seller, but in this case, we're just talking about the buyer, whether the buyer is going to attend the closing in person or whether it's a mail away. The most interesting mail away I've ever done was a client that I had that was actually in Kuwait. He was in Iraq, I think. And so he actually had to go to the American embassy to be able to sign the documentation because we couldn't just do a mobile notary. He actually had to go to the American embassy, get everything done. It was like 9 or 10 hour time difference. So it was just, he was there at like 3 o'clock in the morning so we could do a 12 o'clock closing, and it was just all sorts of fun. So we just need to let the title company know right away if this is the case, because if they're not going to be here, then we need to make sure we make accommodations to get them the documents and all of that. So that's important. And then the commission being earned from the transaction. Keep in mind, the commission does not go on the contract anywhere. That is all negotiated outside of the sales contract. So on the MLS, it has, you know, me as the listing agent, I'm offering 3% on this commission, or 3% commission on this transaction. Unfortunately, there are shady agents into the MLS and change that. So what I always suggest is the minute you execute a contract, print out a copy of your MLS and save it to your computer. Because what I want is a time-stamped saved document to show that as of, you know, June 5th, this property was advertised as a 3% commission, and I had executed my contract at that point. If you go change it to 2.5 a week later, well, no, this is what it was. Here's the timestamp showing when I saved this. Unfortunately, there are unethical agents out there, despite our best efforts to try and weed them out of business, but just always kind of be cognizant of that as you're working through. And this, I meant to put the new picture in here, but you need to create a transaction record. So when you go into the back office, you'll actually click on transactions. I don't know why this slide didn't update. You'll actually go into transactions and you will create a new contract record. And by doing that, what you do is you're telling the system, hey, I've got a new executed contract. You're going to put in the seller's name, the buyer's name, the address, all of that. And all of this goes into the back office. This is how the administrators can go in and make sure that all your paperwork is compliant and that you can get paid at closing. And then you need to know your contractual contingency deadlines. Try saying that 3 times fast. Your buyer only has so much time to deliver escrow, to have their inspections, to have financing contingencies. And do you guys know, okay, we're gonna step back. Is this calendar days or is this business days on the contract?
Calendar.
Okay, and when does the calendar start?
Day that your contract's executed.
So it's actually the day after the last person has signed the contract. So let's say my buyer signed it yesterday, my seller signed it today, day one is tomorrow. So you want to make sure that you keep track of that. So day one is always the day after the date of the last signature on the contract. Now, this is something else that I'll touch on quickly. When you are using e-sign or things like that and you have initials, there's a timestamp on it. So we know that this initial was done at this time. If you get wet initials, or you're not doing it digitally where there's a track, have them put the date next to their initial. Because what will happen is the last date I see would be on page 12 of the contract. But we may not have done initials for 3 or 4 days after. But if we don't have a date there, we don't know the date of the last change, basically. So pay attention to your contingency deadline. So it is calendar days, beginning the day after the last signature. So if they have 3 days to deposit escrow, what happens if that falls on a Saturday or Sunday? When the title company wouldn't be open. So let's say they have 3 days to deposit escrow. Today's Thursday. So day 1 is Friday, day 2 is Saturday, day 3 is Sunday. Title company's not open on Sunday. When is that money due?
Monday morning.
By 5 p.m. on Monday. So if it lands on a Saturday or Sunday, it's due by 5 p.m. on Monday. Now, that's received. That's not, I put the check in the mail on Monday. That is, the title company receives it on Monday. So these are things that we have to pay attention to. Your inspection period. Let's say we've got a 14-day inspection period, and on day 14, you send a repair request. The seller doesn't respond to it until day 15. In your 14-day inspection window, could you still get the buyer's escrow back if they decide to cancel on day 15?
I would think so.
Because you made the request within your 14-day window, yes, you can get it back. There's been some fights, and there's been some lawsuits, and there's been some discussions about it, but that's what we've been told, as long as you make that request. Now, if you've got a 14-day inspection period, have the inspection done in the first 7 days. Don't put it down to the last minute, because again, we know what these deadlines are in advance, so we want to be able to stay ahead of them. And if you have anything you want to pop in.
No,
Okay.
no, listen,
And then you are the responsible person to be certain that the satisfaction of the contingencies are met prior to their deadline. Now here's one other one, and this one gets people into trouble. The contract says that we have a certain number of days for loan contingency, right? Or lender financing contingency. Let's say we have a 45-day closing, and typically that field is going to default to 30 days. So what happens is we go to 30 days. The buyer is supposed to put in writing to the seller that their financing contingency has been satisfied. Now, 45-day closing, 30-day financing contingency. At day 30, I probably don't have it clear to close yet. But what happens is we have to go to the lender and say, hey, our financing contingency is about to expire. Is everything good? Is there anything on the horizon we need to be aware of? Anything that would make this shaky? Because on day 31, if we have not provided written documentation or written notice to the seller has 3 days to cancel that contract. Because we didn't provide written notice. So now let's say this seller gets a backup offer. It's a cash offer. And they're like, I'd really like to take that. The buyer has a financing contingency. Day 30 comes and goes. Nobody makes any notification in writing, which the contract says we will. And the seller goes, okay, here's my cancellation. The buyer freaks out and goes, what are you talking about? We're closing in 12 days. Everything's perfect. Why are you canceling? Because we had a commitment in that contract that we didn't live up to. And now the seller can cancel with no recourse whatsoever and go take that backup offer, and the buyer is furious. And who are they furious at? You. So these are the kinds of things that you really have to pay attention to your deadlines. I typically say, when I set my reminders, I set them 2 days ahead of when they're actually due. So 2 days before my financing contingency expires, I'm calling the lender saying, hey, we got 2 days. Do I need to get an extension on this, or are we good? Those are the kinds of things. So even though your deadline might be Friday afternoon, set your reminder for it even a day or two ahead of that to be able to stay ahead.
Just to clarify,
Yes, ma'am.
that would only be post 30 days, correct? That the seller can say no.
So they have a 3-day period after that financing contingency. If it was not made in writing, they have 3 days that they can cancel that contract. Now, you get to day 33, the buyer never made notice, the seller didn't cancel, that whole thing washes out and you continue moving to closing.
And when you say notice, you mean written notice.
Right, so you send an email to the agent that says, hey, per the contract, I'm letting you know I verified with the lender that the buyer's financing is solid and we're good to go. As long as it's in writing. It doesn't have to be an actual addendum, it doesn't have to be, but it has to be documented, written to the seller's agent.
So that kind of an email, that written notification,
Mhm.
you just save that into a file somewhere in the back
Correct.
office?
Yeah. So once you send the email, I typically just click the little printer and print it to a PDF, and that way it gets saved as loan commitment.
And that's whether they responded or not. You can just, once you send the email,
Right.
you got your proof.
Correct. Because as long as I have done that, then the seller now doesn't have the ability to cancel that contract. So even if they've got this sweet cash backup offer, as long as I do what I'm supposed to do and I keep fulfilling the terms of the contract, that seller is obligated to it as well. Oh, I got ahead of myself. So put all the deadlines 2 days prior to the date on your daily scheduler. So it gives you adequate time to confirm satisfaction of the contingencies or to negotiate extensions if you need them. Community association docs. If there was ever a thorn in a realtor's side, this is it. And probably a title company as well. Estoppel letters and all these other things. HOAs, by and large, are a giant pain in the butt. And if you're an HOA president, I apologize. If you're on an HOA board and you're watching this, I apologize. Be the exception. If the property's in an HOA community, make sure that the buyer submits their application to the HOA if they require it as soon as possible. I can't tell you how many times on a 35-day closing, we go to the HOA and they go, oh, we only approve applications the second Tuesday of every month. Well, okay, cool. If I miss this month, I've completely blown our closing and we're now pushing it back 2, 3, 4 weeks and there's nothing we can do about it. So be proactive. Typically, if you're on the listing side, find out what those criteria are from the HOA, get the community documents. Legally, the seller is required to provide the covenants and restrictions, the bylaws, and a copy of the most current year's budget to the buyer. It's all in the HOA addendum. The seller may have to pay $80 to get those documents, but they are legally required to do it. So I can't tell you how many times the seller goes, I don't know, I've never had those documents. Make the buyer go get it. And actually, when I was early on, I had to pay for 2 of them because I was like, my buyer's got to have it. And I didn't know the contract well enough, so I forked out the $80 to get the documents for my client. And then I had sat down with an attorney, and the attorney's like, no, the seller legally has to provide them. So if that means the seller has to buy them, then the seller has to buy them. I had no idea. So try and get as much information as you can if you're on the listing side, because you're going to save yourself a world of headache. If you know, hey, they only approve new applications the second Tuesday of the month, you need to make sure your buyer's on that, there, or that application is in, or whatever it is, to make sure you can hit the closing date. Standard terms of the contract state the seller's responsible for providing them. And then the inspection. So you should always, always, always encourage the buyer to have an inspection. I typically say it needs to be a property inspection and it needs to be a termite inspection. A termite inspection is $50 to $100, and sometimes it is the best $100 you could spend. And I'll give you an example. My wife has a deal that we're working currently. I say we because she's on vacation. We had a termite inspection done, and the company said there was wood decaying fungi. And there was one little line at the bottom, and it said, "Is there evidence of living or dead termite activity?" He said no and no. But he put one little line at the bottom that said, termite wings or something located. Well, I had read it as no live, no dead, and wood destroying fungi, which is basically just wood rot. That's what we have in Florida. As humid as we are, almost every house has it. So I was like, well, that's a few $100 to just, it's always the fascia at the front of the house. I'm like, it's a couple $100 to replace the wood, not a huge deal. Well, when I was calling around, they're like, well, wait a second. This says that there was termite activity. And I was like, no, you checked no. Well, I had another termite company go out. I paid the $50 to have a second opinion. And he's like, oh no, there's drywood termites all through the back of this house. Well, that $50 second opinion inspection, the house is now being tented for $1,800 that my buyer would have been on the hook for, because if we had not done a termite inspection, we would have never known. So absolutely have these inspections, get these things done. And then also, and this is my rule for everything, never send your client one name for anybody. A plumber, an electrician, an inspector, a lender, never give them one name. Because what happens when you give them one name and then something goes bad with that relationship? Oh, Greg told me to call them and now it went bad, so now it's Greg's fault. What I want to do is I want to send you at least 2, typically 3 options. Here are 3 different people you can call. These are companies that I've used in the past or my clients have used in the past with good results. And I'm comfortable that any of them would do a good job for you. But ultimately, you, Mr. Buyer, Mrs. Buyer, get to decide which one you want. That is just one of those cover your butt protection things, just because we live in a very litigious society.
Does a home inspection also include the surrounding property, like trees and arborists and?
Typically not, because your home inspectors have been taught to just stay in their lane. So a lot of your home inspectors won't inspect pools. They won't inspect foundations. They won't do arborist tree kind of things. They'll tell you like the tree is touching the roof, those kinds of things. But for the most part, if you have a concern about any of it, call people specific to that and get everybody out there you can. A lot of times an inspector will say, hey, there's a crack in the garage floor or a crack in the sidewalk. I can't rule out that this is some sort of settlement issue. At that point, you're calling a geological survey or geological engineer, structural engineer, to have them come out and do kind of a second opinion on it.
And if you're like the agent and you see trees, like big cypress trees on property leaning,
right,
and you're nervous to bring a buyer in, especially we live in Florida with hurricane.
Right.
Who's responsible for calling in the arborist or?
Typically, I would say your seller.
Seller, okay.
So here's what I always say. In real estate, I sell homes. I don't sell cars, I don't sell furniture, I don't sell appliances, I sell homes. So I want to stay in my lane. If there's a buyer that comes in and goes, I want to buy all the furniture, or I want the house fully furnished. If the house is going through a lender doesn't want to see all the furniture, because in their mind, their loan is now paying for furniture, and they don't lend for furniture. So what I tell them is, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we're going to go through, we're going to do an inventory of everything you'd like left in the house, and we are going to do a separate bill of sale where you purchase this for $1 from the seller, and at closing, you physically hand the seller $1 for everything in the house. Now, in reality, the purchase price of the home is factoring that all those things are going to stay. But when it comes to lending and it comes to everything else, I don't sell furniture. Lenders don't lend for furniture. That's between you two. I will facilitate that conversation, but it is a totally separate agreement between you two that I'm not in. I actually had one house where there was a 53 Corvette sitting in the garage. And the guy said, I'll give you full asking price, but the Corvette stays. They made it work. I don't know how they made it work, but they did a separate bill of sale for the car. So it's things like that, just things to be aware of. And then if a home inspection is done and there are issues that require more inspections in order for the buyer to make a decision on them, then the inspection period at the deadline, you'll need to negotiate an extension before you've reached the end of it. Typically, I always say, unless you're in just a crazy hyper-competitive, there's 6 offers on this house, so you're trying to get your client in there, go ahead and put 14 or 15 days for inspection. There are times where I've advised buyers, hey, let's do a 7-day inspection period because it'll make us more competitive. We're not tying up the property as long. But as a rule of thumb, I typically say, go ahead and put 14 days on there and order your inspection day 2. Like, get it done as quick as you can so that you have time to work through any of those issues that come in if you need to. Now, we kind of touched on this, and again, I got ahead of myself. The contract by default provides 45 days for the buyer to obtain loan commitment. It's important that you keep in touch and request updates from the lender, and if the deadline comes and the loan commitment is not accomplished, you need to negotiate an extension. Don't risk your buyer losing escrow. So there are instances where the seller can receive the buyer's escrow even if loan commitment is delivered. You want to stay on top of that loan commitment date, and if you need to extend the closing date to give the lender more time, you want to extend the loan commitment as well. Now, this is important. A lot of people will come in and say, we need to push the closing date back 10 days. Okay, cool. But your loan commitment still ends here. We're extending the closing date, but if we don't extend that loan commitment date as well, if the lender comes back and goes, hey, I can't do it, the buyer loses their escrow. So you want to extend the closing date as well as the loan commitment date when you do that closing date extension addendum. Now, this is kind of where we were talking about. So upon the buyer's receipt of the loan commitment, buyer shall provide written notice to the seller. If the buyer does not receive loan commitment by the date, either party can cancel this contract up to the date of the buyer's delivery, or, where'd it go? 7 days prior to the closing date, blah, blah, blah. If either party timely cancels the contract and the buyer is not in default under the terms of the contract, the buyer can be refunded the deposit, but the seller can still cancel. And then if the buyer delivers written notice, actually this is the old version of the contract, that's why this looks weird. Then basically the contract doesn't close, the deposit gets paid to the seller. Now, a survey. Very few lenders a year ago would ever give you a loan on a property that didn't have a survey. For some reason now, there's about half a dozen lenders that are not requiring surveys. It is the craziest thing in the world to me, because if you don't have a survey, you don't know what you're buying.
Can I interject?
Yeah, please.
The lenders have never required surveys. The reason that surveys are required is because what the lender requires is a type of endorsement on the lender's policy.
Okay.
Florida Form 9.
Okay.
Without a Florida Form 9, without a survey, the title cannot issue a Florida Form 9 without a survey. So the lender, we've noticed this even more recently, that the lender's gone, we don't require a survey, I don't have problems. Because their policy requires this endorsement, and without the survey, they can't get the endorsement, therefore they won't do the loan without the endorsement.
Interesting.
So that's the whole circle of so the next time a lender tells you that they don't need a survey, ask them if their underwriters require a Florida Form 9. They'll change their tune pretty quick.
Interesting. Okay, well there you go. Now I've learned something new as well. Because that's where I had been told by lenders, they're like, well, you don't require a survey. I'm like, how in the world do you not require a survey? Because the survey tells you exactly what you own. if there are any encumbrances, if there are any easements, if there are anything that would impact this property, the survey is going to be what tells you. Now, the other thing that I typically say is when you're having a survey, get an elevation certificate at the same time. Because the elevation certificate, a lot of times a property is zoned in, let's say, the AE flood zone. So it's in the 100-year floodplain. But what happens is only one tiny little piece of the property is actually in the floodplain. The rest of the home is up above the required floodplain. So instead of your flood insurance being $3,000 a year, because it's just one little piece of your property, your flood insurance might be $500 or $600 a year. But without that elevation certificate, they're not able to know what the elevation of that property is, and it could make a very big difference, especially in flood zone properties. Always ask the seller if they have a property survey. This is important too, because if the seller has a survey, we can either use it or we can have it recertified. And it's like,
maximum is 3 years.
okay,
Because any longer than that, the Form 9 can't be issued
okay,
without the surveyor actually going out there, which
I
they're
see.
gonna charge you the same
Same
as
price.
the reserve.
okay. So if it's been more than 3 years,
And every title company is different, but our underwriters say 3 years. Some will go as long as 5 years.
okay,
Just so you.
nice. That's also good to know. But typically what I say is even if the seller has a survey that's 5, 7, 10 years old, I'd still like a copy of it. Because we've had instances in the past where we can just have it recertified, and it's like $300 to recertify it versus what, $600 or $700 sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes it depends on the size of the property.
So, you know, always ask. If the seller has it, it's better to go ahead and get it. The more information you get, the better you are. And then, yeah, depending on the age of an existing survey will determine what needs to be done. And then a property appraisal. So the lender's going to require an appraisal for verification of value that it meets the condition for the loan type. FHA, VA, and conventional, they all have different criteria in terms of what their appraisals entail. On a conventional appraisal, the appraisal stays with the buyer. On an FHA appraisal, it actually stays with the property for 90 days. So let's say I have an FHA buyer and the house is listed for $325, we're under contract for $325, and appraisal comes in at $300. And the seller goes, well, forget that, I'm gonna cancel and go get a new buyer. I'm gonna get a conventional buyer. Well, that's great, except that because it's an FHA appraisal, it's locked to your property for 90 days. So, cool, go get a conventional buyer, but you're gonna sit for 91 days. Most of the time when they realize that, they're like, well, crap, okay, we're gonna just do it. Or we find some middle ground somewhere. On a VA appraisal, VA is a whole other world. And if you guys ever do VA, I'll be more than happy to sit and talk to you about some of the fun nuances that come with it. But with a VA appraisal, it's almost like an inspection. They actually go through, throwing stuff. They actually go through, and if a house is missing one of these 88-cent plug plates, they will actually require that that get replaced. One of the craziest things I ever had is a door frame was cracked. The VA appraiser required them to have that filled, sanded, and repainted before they would do an appraisal or complete the appraisal on that home.
Would that be like vital hazard?
Well, it's just, there's certain conditions and things like that that they just say the house has to be to this condition. You can't have rooms that have 2 types of flooring that don't have a joining piece there. Things like that.
Is there a list somewhere of these types of things
Not that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen anything
I've never
with it.
seen the list, but it's kind of, basically with a VA loan, they want the veterans to go into the home without making any repairs, any painting, any.
Right, any alteration.
Nothing, and it's gotta be, like you said, any kind of different flooring, a crack in the wall, they don't want anything like that.
Right. So,
Is it I know that some sellers have the option to go on a pre-appraisal list, if they have an idea of the value of the home. and
Right.
the lender's gonna want. Is it better for them to do that so they can get some of these things done ahead of time?
So now here's the thing, when you order a pre-appraisal, so basically you're just ordering a private appraisal, it's going to be more like a conventional appraisal. So a lender can't actually use that appraisal for their purposes. They're still going to order a new appraisal. But I've never had an appraiser when I go, hey, I had an appraiser do this one a month ago. Here's the full report. I'm literally doing your job for you. Here you go. I've never had them come back with something different. So I typically say yes. If there's a question or if it's a unique property or I'm having a really hard time finding good comparables, I've got a phenomenal appraiser. We call her. It's $300 to $350, and we have a really good value.
So if you like, you know, maybe there's an all cash buyer that's coming this way on the second property, this is your listing. And they get a pre-appraisal, they're not gonna get another appraisal. They don't have
No, they wouldn't have to if they don't have a lender. Right. But at least then you can say, hey, this house is listed below appraisal. It appraises for $390,000, I list it for $389,900, my house is listed below appraisal. $100, it's below appraisal. And people are gonna go, wait, it's below appraisal? That's a bargain, I want that one. So sometimes for the $300, $350, yeah, it's worth getting the appraisal and having it in hand. The cost of the appraisal is the buyer's responsibility, and it's typically paid at the time of scheduling. When you do have a buyer, you want them to be aware they're gonna have to pay for their inspections and they're gonna have to pay for their appraisal out of pocket. So just understand there are some costs for the buyer when they go in. And then property insurance. Now, if they have a lender, they're gonna be required to have property insurance. Every lender has a company they work with, but they're also more than able to shop other companies to see if they can get a better rate than what their lender's company can get. From my experience, I can typically beat a lender's rate, meaning if a lender has an affiliation and it's $1,200 a year, I can usually find a company that can beat it by about 10 to 20%. Just because the nature of the insurance world is so competitive that, you know, sometimes it's just a matter of, oh, I have access to a different company than they do, that I can get better rates or things like that. On a cash property or a cash purchase, they are not required to have insurance, but I highly, highly recommend it. There are some cash buyers that go, nah, it's fine. I don't want insurance. Okay, more power to you. And then, so yeah, that basically, the copy of that insurance policy gets submitted to the title company as well. And then what happens to it? They just basically execute it as part of the closing documents.
On the property insurance? Yeah, on your settlement statement, usually if it's a loan, it's paid for out of the closing costs. So we collect the full premium and then we use that dollar amount to prorate the premium for the upcoming payments on a loan.
Gotcha.
For cash, it's just given us so we can exchange it.
Okay.
To the new person.
Nice. So when you're representing the buyer a week before closing, so we've gotten through our inspections, we've gotten through our appraisals, we've gotten through escrow. At this point, we want to verify that all the transaction data is complete and all of your forms are in the back office. Now, in order to be able to get your commission check, your commission disbursement authorization, it has to be in 3 business days before closing. Now, in this case, it's business days because our finance department doesn't work weekends. So if you're closing on Monday, you submit it on Friday, it's not 3 days. Typically, we say a week before closing, you want to make sure all of your documents are in, everything has gone through compliance, everything is the way it should be. And you go ahead and click that commission disbursement authorization button, and it gets sent right to the title company for you. It is so nice to get paid at closing, where they cut one check to Florida Luxury and one check to you, and you get to leave closing and, you know, go celebrate. That's a nice feeling. When you don't have the commission disbursement authorization, it's typically 7 to 10 days by the time Florida Luxury gets the check, puts the check in the bank, the check clears, and then they cut your check. So I always like to give that warning. It's just better to go ahead and have this done and get paid at closing.
That's not to be confused with your commissions, though. The total commission.
Correct.
We need right away to put on the CD for the approval with the lender. The CDA can come later.
Okay, thank you.
A lot of people confuse.
Mix those up. So 72 hours before closing, it's still 3 days, but the buyer has to receive the lender's final closing statement for review. So this is TRID, and lenders are the only industry, aside from maybe the military, that makes acronyms out of acronyms. But the TRID, basically, the rule that came in October of 17, basically says that there's a 3-day cooling off period, is kind of how I phrase it. I don't know what they actually call it. But basically, it just says that the buyer has to have 3 days ahead of closing that they get to review the closing documents and make sure that what the lender told them up front is what is actually true now. You also want to, at this point, have them schedule the utility to be activated in their name. Some companies require proof of ownership, so if that's the case, they'll get that at closing. But I typically encourage them, call the cable company, call the electric company, call the utilities, call the trash service, get all these things. Because as soon as you move, you're gonna have a ton of trash. And if you're like, crap, I forgot to set up the trash, and now you've got a trash can full of stuff for 2 weeks, it's not a lot of fun. Now, 48 hours before closing, the buyer needs to coordinate the amount and the method to provide the final down payment and closing costs for the closing. This will always be a wire. The buyer is going to have to wire those funds from their bank to the title company. And in all of our paperwork, in as big, bold, red letters as we can possibly make it, I, as the agent, never want a part of this. I don't want the title company to send me the wiring instructions. I don't want to see it. I don't want to know anything about it. When they send it to the buyer actually is going to call the title company and confirm the routing and account number and read it back to the title company. What we have had is people who will intercept emails, change that routing and accounting number, that routing and account number, and all of a sudden your buyer wires $60,000. It goes to an offshore account in, who knows where, and there is nothing your buyer can do. That money is gone. So always, always, always make sure that your buyer and your title company are talking about those wiring instructions. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want copies of it. I don't want to know about it. I just need to make sure it gets done. And then 48 hours, coordinate the final walkthrough inspection with the buyer. Now, sometimes if it's an owner-occupied property and the seller's still in the process of moving out because, it's tight, they won't always have everything out 48 hours before closing. If the house is vacant, go ahead and do the walkthrough. A lot of agents get in the habit of saying, well, if we close at 10, we're going to do the walkthrough at 9:30. I actually discourage this because, and I'll give you an example. I had an agent that called me last week. Hey, we're closing in 30 minutes. We just did the walkthrough. We have an addendum where the seller has agreed to remove all the trash and debris from the yard and the house. We just did the walkthrough and there's trash everywhere. What can I do? Not much. You can execute an addendum if you can get the buyer and seller both to sign it that says the seller's going to give you a credit to have this stuff done. But you really probably should have done this 2 days ago where we had time to actually get this resolved. So just understand all the moving parts. If nothing else, you could say, hey, I know you guys are packing up. I know the house will be a mess. Can we still do our walkthrough, 24, 36, 48 hours ahead of closing? And then you might want to do a final walkthrough once everything's out. Also, on that walkthrough sign-off, you want to make sure that either your buyer or a buyer's representative physically does that walkthrough. I, as the agent, am not doing that walkthrough for them. Because what's going to happen? I'm going to walk in and go, yep, the air's working, yep, the fridge is cold, yep, the electric's on, the water runs, everything's good. I sign off on it as the agent, and then now all of a sudden, they're not here for whatever reason. They fly in the next week, they come in, the air conditioner's busted. Guess whose fault it is? Mine, because my signature's on that paper. So, there are some workarounds. I have done it where I've actually put them on FaceTime and, kind of did it and walked through and said, hey, the air is blowing. At some point, they're taking my word for it because they can't feel it through the phone. Right. But at that point, it's kind of a mitigated risk, and they're still signing that walkthrough form themselves. So, and then this is the perfect time to prepare your closing gift. There are some agents that are far more creative than I ever was. They come up with some really cute closing gifts. Typically, if it's a family that's moving in, it's usually like dinner's on me, like a $50 gift card somewhere, pizza place or restaurant or something where it's, hey, you guys don't have to, you're moving, everything's going on, you don't have to worry about it. Other ones do these really cute baskets that have paper towels and toilet paper and Windex and like all sorts of cutesy little cleaning stuff. And there's just some really cute ideas. I'm just not nearly that creative. So, but it is a good idea to attend your closings and to have a closing gift. I can't tell you how many clients I had to go, wait, you're gonna come to closing with me? Of course I'm coming to closing with you. You're the first agent I've ever had that has ever shown up for a closing. I've gotten your butt this far. You better believe I'm going to show up at closing to celebrate with you when you finally get it done. But apparently, a lot of agents just don't, and it is mind-boggling to me. So, your final walkthrough, the buyers provided the opportunity to do the final walkthrough. We kind of talked about this. Make sure that everything is as it should be. There weren't stainless steel appliances when we signed the contract. Now all of a sudden there's white Kenmore appliances sitting there. This has happened. Typically when your inspector goes through, they take pictures of the model numbers and everything of the appliances that are there. I typically take that inspection report with me and just make sure that what was there is what was still there. A lot of times what people will do is they've got this nice 3-door fridge and they've got like a crappy fridge in the garage, and all of a sudden they take this one out and put that one there and go, well, no, the contract just said there's a refrigerator. No, we agreed that the house was going to include that refrigerator. Here's the model number, here's the whatever, because guess what? That seller might be stroking a check for a new refrigerator. That's the same as whatever the one they just took. So we have to be vigilant and pay attention to these things. So now we're all done and we're ready to close. We want to make sure we have the buyer complete the buyer's final inspection walkthrough, which we just talked about. And then they also need to be certain that they have their driver's licenses. They have to have their driver's licenses. I can't tell you how many times I showed up and they're like, crap, it's in the moving truck. It's in one of my purses and like a box halfway through the truck. Just let them know ahead of time. You're going to have your driver's license at closing.
It has to be valid.
Oh, it can't be expired.
It cannot be expired. It has to be a valid ID.
What about a passport?
Passport's fine as long as it's got their picture in there.
Right.
It's valid. Or whatever ID they use.
It has to be current and valid. Okay, there you go. And then after closing, you want to immediately deliver any of the FLR office, the post-closing requirements, a signed closing statement, a copy of your commission check, the check to Florida Luxury Realty, and a signed buyer walkthrough form. Typically what I do is I have the title company make a copy of everything, my check, the final walkthrough, and I have them send everything right to the Fort Ritchie office. Unless for me personally, I go to all the offices so often that I usually end up dropping it off myself. But, if I have a closing in South Tampa, I don't necessarily want to have to drive all the way to the Fort Ritchie office to deliver it. Now, see this word immediately? That means it needs to happen now, not, oh, I'm going to put this in my car and deliver it a week from now. That's why I typically say just let the title company mail it. That way, it's their responsibility, it gets out that day, and it's done. And then what else you should do? So update your leads record to reflect your buyer as a past client. Set up their drip campaigns, make a social media post thanking them, and then always follow up about a week later. Hey, just checking on you. How's everything at the new house? Is there anything you need? Anything I can do for you? You know, always do that 1 week checkup. Now, looking at it from the seller side. So the good news is on the seller side, there's a lot less to do. So we're going to move through this pretty quickly. On the seller side, you need to make sure that your buyer, whether you represent them or not, make sure that escrow has been made and make sure you get a copy of that escrow receipt as well. Because we're going to require it on the listing side to confirm that that escrow has been done. Again, the legible copy of the executed contract, we're going to need to make sure that everybody has a copy of it. The closing company is also going to need our seller's contact information. So they're going to need their name, their social, their, you know, blah, 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 the loan payoff, the, you know, if they're going to be present for closing, all those things, even on the seller side, you're going to have to provide that to the title company. Create a transaction management record. So basically, when you go into your transactions, you will already have a listing record because we have a listing, obviously. And then what you do is you just click contract, and it'll ask, do you represent the buyer or not? And if you say no, then you just put in the contract documents and all of that. And then the system knows, hey, I only represent the seller, so I'm not going to harp you for all the buyer documents. And then accommodate the inspection scheduling. Now, when you're working on the seller side, you are going to kind of play middleman between the buyer's agent and your seller. So a lot of what you're going to do is, hey, Mr. Selling Agent, you know, we want to do the inspection next Friday at 2. Does that work for the seller? I have to turn around and call the seller and say, hey, they want to do inspections Friday at 2. Is that okay with you? Can you have the dog out? Can you, you know, whatever. And then you go back to the buyer's agent. So it's just a lot of like playing a game of telephone. But what you need to do is make sure that you set the expectation to the seller that we need to accommodate these things. Because the last thing I want to do is give an extension if we don't have to. Because I want my seller, I'm representing the seller side of things, I don't want to issue any extensions. I don't want closing extensions, I don't want inspection extensions, because those are just more time for things to go wrong. I want, if we're going to say it's 14 days, I want to make sure it's done. If it's been 7 days and the buyer hasn't done an inspection, I might be reaching out to the buyer's agent going, hey, are they doing one? Are they not? On the seller side, there's what I call the cone of silence. So again, if I'm representing the seller and the buyer's agent's not communicating, they're not doing inspections, they're not doing whatever, I'll drop into the cone of silence and just go, okay, cool. That just passed, and now we're out of inspections, so that contingency is gone. Now we're waiting for lending contingency. Okay, cool, you don't send it to me? Hey, Mr. Seller, just wanted to let you know, per the contract, here's what you could do. Personally, I wouldn't recommend canceling the contract, but, you know, if it's what you want to do, I'm just letting you know what your options are at this point, you know, things like that. So on the seller side, we just do a little bit more babysitting. You know, just paying attention to deadlines and kind of keeping an eye on what's going on. Also, making sure the appraisal gets ordered and things like that. And then all your appointments for those needing access to the property go onto your schedule. So that, let's say, for example, they have an inspection. I want to make sure that I can be available for questions. You know, if the inspector's there and he's like, hey, can you get me the answer on this? Typically, the buyer's agent will call the listing agent and say, hey, the inspector's got a question about this or that. So I want to make sure that I'm aware when these things are going on so I can have some availability to handle those. From somebody who's worked with buyers, I can tell you there's nothing more frustrating than needing an answer and not being able to get a hold of the other agent to get an answer that's quick and easy, and it just creates all sorts of turmoil. And again, providing the community association docs. So we talked about it from the buyer side, but understand what your seller is obligated to. So when you take the listing and it's a home in an HOA, preempt them and say, hey, do you have your community documents, your covenant restrictions, your budget? If not, I need you to get those to me. Set that expectation right up front. And then again, you're going to ask the seller by the time you take the listing, hey, do you have a survey? If you've got it, can you go ahead and provide it to me? Because I'm going to put it out there, and that way we've got it. And then be prepared that with some loan types, the property condition must meet qualifications. So kind of what we were talking about with FHA and VA. So as we're taking listings and working from the seller side, just be cognizant of that. If you see a house that's just maybe not in great condition, maybe I'm not going to accept VA financing on that property because I'm setting my seller up for an issue. So just be aware of what you've got and what some of those criteria look like. Now, a week before closing, verify that all the transaction record data is complete and all the compliance forms are all uploaded. Again, because you're not going to have all the buyer broker agreement and things like that because you don't represent the buyer, unless you do. You just want to make sure that all of your documents are in there. If there have been any addenda that have been added to the contract, make sure those got put into your contract record. This is something a lot of agents miss because it's not really required, meaning the system doesn't have any way to know whether we put a repair addendum, a closing extension, or whatever. But if any of those things get executed, they need to be uploaded into the back office because that's all part of that deal. That's part of the paperwork for that deal. So we need to make sure that all those things actually get uploaded. And then 72 hours before, you want to verify with the buyer's agent that the lender has provided their final closing disclosures and all of that we are actually good to close. And then remind the buyer's agent, or if you're a really good seller's agent, which I highly encourage everybody to be, get a list from them of who the utility companies are. Because they've been living there, they know who they are. I typically just say, hey, here's Mr. Buyer's agent, here's the list of the utility companies that they use. You know, they've got an ADT alarm system, they've got, you know, Bright House Cable, they've got, you know, whatever electric, whatever, you know, provide that information because it's just making the process easier. And I'll tell you, the agents that go above and beyond that actually get me those things, I remember who they are. And I might be just a little bit more excited the next time I have a buyer that's looking at one of their listings. Hey, Mr. Buyer, this is a great house. And oh, by the way, the agent's really good to work with too. As opposed to, oh, I know that agent, and this is not going to be smooth. You know, that's just not a good feeling. Unfortunately, real estate is a smaller community than a lot of people realize, and just doing those little things can make all the difference in the world. 48 hours before closing, the seller should receive their preliminary closing statement from the title company to confirm and understand the final closing costs. So they can actually look this over and say, hey, here's my bottom line, here's what I've agreed to pay, you know, my prorated taxes, my commission amount, all those things. Typically, you as the agent will get a copy of that as well. The only thing you're really going to pay attention to is the sales price is correct, the commission amount is correct. Because outside of that, I don't know what the per diem on the taxes and all the other jazz is supposed to be. So if the sales price is right and the commissions are right, yep, it looks good to me. So, oh, and the admin fees. You want to make sure that the admin fees are on there as well. And then again, you just want to coordinate with the buyer's agent to make sure they're going to do the final walkthrough. Not every company requires a walkthrough. So I typically like to have this dialogue with the buyer's agent to say, hey, even if your company doesn't require it, mine does. Can you make sure that this form gets filled out and email them the form? I really need to make sure your buyer signs this form because it's part of what my company requires. Now, if their company has their own walkthrough form, that's totally fine. We can accept it. It doesn't have to be the Florida Luxury walkthrough. It can be Keller Williams, Remax, Century 21, whatever. But we have to make sure that we do get a copy of that final walkthrough. And then again, for your seller, get a cute closing gift, something that they're going to remember you by, whether they're, you know, moving across town or moving across the country. Obviously, what you get then may be different, but just be memorable. And then confirm the buyers are good with the final walkthrough. Make sure that you get all of the keys from the seller to take to closing. Garage door remotes. This is the one thing everybody forgets. Oh crap, the garage door is in my other car. I don't have it with me. just remind them the day ahead, hey, do any of your neighbors have keys to the house? Do you have any other garage door remotes? Are there separate keys for other doors in the house, not just the front door? Those kinds of things. And then make sure also they have valid photo IDs as well. And then again, deliver all the documents to Florida Luxury, update your CRM, and celebrate. Do you guys have any questions about that process, kind of what you go through? No?
That seems like a lot.
It is.
Yeah, I feel a little overwhelmed myself.
Yeah, and it is. But the good thing is a lot of these get set up on the contract, so it's just a matter of, okay, I've got 14 days for inspections. I've got to make sure the inspection happens. I have 35 days for loan commitment. I've got to make sure the lending happens. I've got, all these other things. Most of it is just being proactive. I always tell the lenders that I work with, I have 2 rules. I want good news fast and bad news faster, and I don't want to chase you down for updates. Those are my 2 rules. If you do those 2 things, we're going to get along just fine.
What were they doing?
I want bad news fast. I'm sorry, good news fast and bad news faster, and I don't want to have to chase you down for updates. That's it. So, and I kind of make the same rule to the buyer's agent. I'm like, look, this is all I'm asking from you. Good news fast, bad news faster, and don't make me chase you down for updates. Send me a quick little, hey, everything's moving along, once a week. As a buyer's agent, I set a reminder. Typically Thursday afternoons are my, just send out my updates on all the deals I have pending. Reach out to my lenders, reach out to the title companies, reach out to whoever, and just say, hey, is there anything out there? Are we still waiting on anything? Are there any issues? Is everything okay? If you can stay ahead of it, this becomes a lot less stressful. There is nothing in the world more stressful than being 3 days from closing and going, hey, Mr. Seller, I know you've got the truck sitting in the driveway, but the buyer needs a 7-day extension. How unhappy is that seller going to be in that moment? Well, why didn't we know this 2 weeks ago? Why am I being blindsided by it now? So that's where, no matter which side of the deal you're on, try and stay a step ahead of everybody. And the more you do it, the more second nature it becomes. But if you can instill those habits while you guys are new, and just get in the habit of saying, hey, I just want a weekly update. Just send me a, hey, everything's good. Okay, awesome. Because I just want to know as early as I can where we are and what we're doing. As long as you do that, this is not nearly as daunting or as overwhelming as it feels at this moment. It's just kind of a work through that you kind of establish. When you have 1 deal, this feels a lot more daunting than when you have 5 deals. And I know that sounds totally counterintuitive, but if I've got this on the calendar and it's like, all right, cool, inspection's up on this one. Cool, inspection's up on this one. We're already moving through. It's just like every day I know what's going to happen. Whereas when I have 1 deal, it's like, okay, we're on day 12. Is everything okay? Okay, we're on day 13. Is everything okay? Okay, we're on day 14. You're just dwelling on it. When you've got 5 deals going, you don't have time to dwell on 1 deal. Just keep them going. So just understand there was a lot that we covered, but it's really not as daunting as it seems. So let me see if anybody online has any questions. Let's see. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Do you always need an estoppel certificate? Do we always need an estoppel certificate from an HOA community?
HOA.
Yeah.
And well, if it's a voluntary HOA and the seller has never been a part of the HOA,
Okay,
we don't need one.
gotcha.
But if it's not a voluntary.
Right, if it's mandatory.
Always, yes.
Okay,
If it is a voluntary and they were a part of it, we need
you
the
still
stuff.
need it. Okay, there you go. Do you guys online have any other questions? All right, if not, thank you guys for joining me. If you have any questions, certainly don't hesitate to ask. I'm more than happy to help.